And joining us now is the author of a fascinating new book. If you saw 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago, they did a great profile of a man who kind of shunned the limelight. And interestingly enough, he's going to talk about it tonight. It's the subject of a new book called First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong. And James R. Hansen joined us now by telephone from Dallas, Texas, I believe you're in, right, James?
That's right. I'm going to be speaking at the Museum of Flight here at Love Field in Dallas tomorrow night.
Oh, that's great. And I saw the profile a couple of weeks ago on TV, and Neil Armstrong is a man that really has not done a lot of interviews. How did the project come about to do this book, and how did you get involved?
Well, I'd been writing about aerospace history for about 15 years, and I knew that all of the astronauts, all the early astronauts, with the exception of Neil, had either done memoirs or agreed to have autobiographies or biographies written. And here was Armstrong, the most famous of them all, and he had not agreed to participate with an author. And even though there were books and articles out there about him, I knew, or I strongly suspected, that much of the information was incomplete or exaggerated or even in some cases fabricated, and that turned out to be the case. So I approached him and told him what I wanted to do, and it took about 3 years to get it all straightened out, but Neil gave me the go-ahead.
Yeah, I was struck just watching the interview with him and how humble he is about the whole thing. I think the interview asked him, you're the first man to go on the moon, and he said, well, just circumstance, it just worked out that way. And did you get that feeling that he almost doesn't really want to talk about it even to this day?
Well, that's true. He feels like he has talked about it a lot over the years. He just can't talk about it all the time with everyone that is asking. But in terms of how he is a very humble man. How he came across, I think, on 60 Minutes is exactly who he is. He doesn't put on any kind of airs. In terms of being the Apollo 11 commander, there wasn't anything preordained about Apollo 11 being the first one to land. If 8, 9, and 10 had not worked out perfectly, it could have been 12, or it could have been 13. So, in that sense, Neil's correct. There was no preordained choice that he would be the commander of the first landing mission.
Just reading your book, he came from an interesting family, and I believe he always seemed to have a feeling, or at least the essence I got, that he was destined for some kind of greatness, at least as far as flight goes. Am I reading that right?
Well, I think certainly his mother felt that way about him. Neil himself, I'm not sure he had any particular sense of destiny. He just wanted, he started out, he began loving airplanes, building model airplanes as a boy, and then was dedicated to, he actually went to Purdue University with the idea of becoming an aircraft designer, but he got his college education on a Navy scholarship, which led to him becoming a naval aviator and flying combat in the Korean War, and then came out of that deciding that test piloting was what he wanted to do. He could apply his engineering to aircraft development, and then in the 1950s, with aerospace coming on the horizon and Sputnik and the space program, he just sort of made a natural evolution from aeronautics to space.
And the early astronauts, if not all of them, it seemed like most of them started out as military test pilots, whether it was the Army or the Air Force or the Navy. I guess Alan Shepard was a Navy test pilot. Is that how he got involved with the whole thing?
He had his Navy flying experience in Korea, but then when he left the Navy, he was in the reserves for a period of time. He actually, when he graduated from Purdue, he became a civilian test pilot for the organization that preceded NASA, an organization known as the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which became the nucleus of NASA when NASA was created in 1958. So, yes, indeed, he had the test pilot background, but really from the civilian side rather than the military.
Of course, the movie The Right Stuff kind of coined that phrase, at least from the public perspective. These guys had to have something extra to get into these machines and really see how far they could go and almost take them to they would take them to the limit to see how far they would go, right?
He did, and one thing that the movie doesn't really do a very good job of explaining is the importance of having an engineering background. Neil was really an engineering test pilot. He was an engineer that was flying the airplane and taking an engineering approach to learning. It wasn't just about breaking records or pushing the envelope as perhaps depicted in popular lore, but the real authentic test pilots are the ones that are flying very precisely, very systematically, and they know exactly what they're trying to do in terms of getting more data, not only about the aircraft performance, but about the medium in which they're flying, if they're flying transonic or supersonic. So they're after new knowledge, and it takes an engineer to really approach it in that way.
Talking with James Hansen. The name of the book is First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong. It's published by Simon & Schuster. Let's talk about his early flights. A lot of people may not remember he was part of the Gemini mission, which was preceded Apollo and had to prove that you could do the docking in Earth's orbit, right?
That's right. Rendezvous and docking was one of the main objectives of Gemini because if you didn't do that maneuver successfully, you couldn't do the Apollo mission the way that it was laid out. And in March of 1966, Neil and Dave Scott went up in Gemini 8 to actually perform the very first docking, and the docking was successful, but only for a very short time because there was a problem. Actually, they didn't know what it was initially, but they started to spin at high revolutions, and it turned out that it was a thruster was stuck on the Gemini 8 spacecraft itself, and came very close. I mean, this could have been the first real tragedy in space because they started to spin at such a high rate, and that Neil had to isolate which thruster was the problem and get them out of that. And even after the problem was resolved, it forced the end of the mission. They had to bring them back early, so it was some really high drama early in the space program.
I know on that Gemini missions, they had several things they had to overcome. I believe, I'm not sure what astronaut it was, but did the first spacewalk, and he just couldn't control the lack of gravity, kept spinning and lost a lot of weight in sweat. I think Buzz Aldrin, didn't he kind of invent the way of spacewalking using suction cups or something like that?
Well, yes, Aldrin. I mean, all of the early American spacewalks were very, very challenging. The techniques that were being used were not working very effectively, and they didn't really have a good way to simulate weightlessness in terms of the kind of activities, the kind of extravehicular activity that they were going to do. Aldrin, prior to his Gemini 12 flight, was really responsible for figuring out a lot of the maneuvers, but a lot of that was based on what they had learned and what had gone wrong in previous flights. Yes, Ed White, who made the first American space flight, and Dick Gordon, the later one, they often had some real challenges in terms of getting back in the spacecraft without really physically almost collapsing.
You mentioned before about Neil Armstrong having to control the ship and Gemini to get it back on track after spinning. He's had several experiences like that. They show clips occasionally on TV of him test flying what sort of became the lunar module, and he had to eject from that. He almost was killed in that flight.
That's right. That was a flight of the so-called Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, or LLTV, which took place here in the Houston area in May of 1968, about a year before the Apollo 11 launch. And that was a very strange vehicle that they nicknamed the Flying Bedstead, because what they were trying to do was come up with a vehicle that could actually simulate what it would be like to fly in the lunar environment, where the gravity is only 1/6 of that on Earth. And so it was a very difficult, very dangerous machine to fly, and as shown in the little clip on 60 Minutes, Neil, there was a problem with the machine one day when he was up, and he ejected just a fraction of a second before the machine exploded.
James Hansen joined us. The name of the book is First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong. And how did he get into the Apollo program? Was it just a natural progression from Gemini, or how was he chosen for that particular program?
Well, yes. I mean, once in the space program, the astronauts that were active in Gemini were basically almost all of them made the transition into Apollo. Neil had been commander for Gemini 8 and was selected. It was pretty clear he was going to be a commander in the Apollo program, but it was just, as I said earlier, it wasn't clear exactly how the missions would line up and which one would be the first landing. It just so happened that Neil's number 11 got the call, and he was well prepared for it when the time came.
Yeah, the space program took a major setback when the flight, I guess it was Apollo 1, on the pad had that tragic fire. Was it Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White died in that, right?
That's right. It was... Well, it was, without question, an awful accident, something that no one expected to happen on the ground, and that made it all the worse. I mean, they were kind of used to, if you were in the flight test business, you were accustomed to people being killed, but usually, in flights themselves, and to have this happen in a test on the launch pad was terrible. From a historical perspective, it did allow NASA time, because they had to go investigate everything that was wrong with the command module design, and basically went over to the entire Apollo program, and it set them back about a year or more, but they really needed the time to go back and really review what they had, and in the end they had much better hardware and much better procedures, and really the success, if in a strange kind of way, it's accurate to say historically that if the Apollo fire had not taken place, they probably wouldn't have succeeded by landing on the moon before President Kennedy's deadline of the end of the decade.
Yeah, this book is filled with so many great stories, and we want the people to buy it, but just kind of to take us quickly through, obviously we all know what happened. It was a successful landing on the moon, but there was a little bit of a hairy situation. Once again, Neil Armstrong had to kind of take control of the lunar lander and use some of his own flying maneuvers to avoid some big boulders, and again showing just he did have the right stuff, didn't he?
Yeah, there was the autopilot was taking them down into what was going to be a rather large crater about the size of a football stadium, and at that point Neil had to take over manually, and then there were issues related to how much fuel was left, and then there were some program alarms that went off inside the spacecraft related to so much data. When the radar data that came back from the lunar surface was arriving back at the spacecraft, it overloaded the computers, which of course were not at all. I mean, they had the capacity of about one of our early floppy disks, and so they didn't have a lot of memory and a lot of capacity, and so they had a lot of alarms. So here's Neil with the fuel supply dwindling and the computer alarms going off, bothering him in Aldrin, and having to take over manually. And so, yeah, it was a pretty hairy time getting down to the Sea of Tranquility. It's
amazing when you think of the technology that was used then to get to the moon, and I guess a lot of that kind of spurred on what we have today, the handheld computers and all that. But it is amazing when you think the computers then were so primitive, but it worked. It got the job done. The book is filled with great stories about him and his post-NASA career. I know you go into a lot of the stories about him, but I guess just to finish up with one question, what would you say is the most maybe misunderstood thing about him after his great accomplishment?
Well, I think a lot of people have called him, the press from time to time calls him reclusive or a recluse, like he's some sort of a hermit that doesn't come out like he's not at all like Howard Hughes. I mean, if you think about Howard Hughes and certainly how he was depicted in a recent film, comes off as someone almost emotionally unstable, and Neil's anything but that. I mean, Neil's about as normal and down to earth as you can get, and he actually does do a lot of things. He gives a lot of talks, not only around the country but around the world, but he certainly can't do everything that people ask him to do. And as far as the media goes, he doesn't really, if it's a newsworthy story, then he'll be willing to make a comment, but if it's just a feature story about him or about Apollo 11, and he feels like he's really covered all of the bases before, and he chooses not to do those interviews.
Yeah. Just growing up in the late 60s and 70s, I was glued to the set watching all these great accomplishments in space, and just a thrill to kind of relive that a little bit through your book. And I know you're a professor at, Auburn, right?
University in Alabama.
That's right. And I guess you probably had an interest growing up in this
Well,
too.
I was 17 years old in the summer of 1969, so yeah, I grew up also with those early space missions, and so yeah, the book for myself was kind of a trip back in time too.
Well, it's a great...
what's funny today is that 2/3 of the population of the globe right now were not born in as of July 1969. So it's amazing to think that that mass of humanity, it does not have a first-hand experience with the moon landings. So that's another reason why they need to read their history.
It really is kind of funny. I mean, you talk to people in their 20s and early 30s, they just have no idea that this actually happened unless they happen to read about it or see clips about it. But it's a wonderful book, make a great gift, and we have a great reading audience down here in Sarasota, James, so I'm sure they're going to go out and get it. It's called First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong, and I appreciate you taking a few minutes. I know you're on a busy book tour, but thanks for joining us tonight.
Outstanding. I hope to get down to Sarasota. I have a sister that lives in the area, and maybe I can get down there sometime to give a
great.
talk.
Well, if you do, give us a call at the station. We'd love to see you.
I'll do that.
Thanks, James.
You bet.
We'll talk to you again.